With the dog days of summer upon us, we welcome you to another edition of Truth TV. I'm Lisa K. Donner. On today's episode, if you're old enough to remember the Lovin' Spoonful, you know that the 1966 hit Summer in the City applies now more than ever, as urban centers around the nation boil over with violence. Liberty Nation's Jeff Charles is here to discuss what's happening, where, why, and when. Today, we'll headline an important story that's not getting much oxygen in the mainstream media. Military Affairs correspondent Dave Patterson joins us to discuss the Defense Department's assault on leakers. And in today's Viewpoint, victory is assured for Mr. Trump and his basket of deplorables. I'll pitch out 3 reasons for this prediction. So stay tuned for another jam-packed episode of Liberty Nation's Truth TV.
Truth is making a comeback.
Pick a city, any city, and you're looking at urban centers where the crime rate has exploded. Murders, beatings, lootings are all cropping up like weeds in the inner cities. Some of these areas, it's open season on police. In others, it's open season on law-abiding folks who live there. Now, community leaders are stepping forward, asking for more help from law enforcement. That's pretty hard to do when you want to defund the police department. Liberty Nation socio-political correspondent Jeff Charles joins us with his usual wit and wisdom. Welcome to Truth TV, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, I know it's hot down there in Texas, but it's no better in the swamp here. We're about to crest 100 degrees, so no complaints. Anyway, we have a situation on the Brooklyn Bridge with a cop getting beat over the head. There's concern that another autonomous zone is cropping up, this time in Portland, Oregon. San Francisco is staring down the barrel of a fiasco regarding the grand idea of housing the homeless in hotels only in California. But anyway, let's begin with the facts. How's the crime rate going in some of our major cities so far this summer?
Not so good, surprisingly. It's amazing when you have riots and violent demonstrations, the crime rate goes up. Who knew? Now, the left is trying to say that this is because this is even more of a reason why we should defund the police, but people with common sense know better.
Yeah, I found it interesting to hear from a community leader in Brooklyn who said, enough, we want our anti-crime unit back. Well, do you think we're going to hear more and more from the people who live in the inner cities, who are basically the most affected by all this hoo-ha? Do you think they'll begin voicing the need for law and order?
Oh, yeah, and I'm glad that you put it that way, because it is the people who they claim that they're trying to help that are the most impacted by the spiking crime rates due to them fomenting the violence. And the thing is, we're already hearing about it from New York, but also Black community leaders in Minneapolis, which is the epicenter of the defund the police movement. They're speaking out pretty aggressively against this and have been doing so for the past few months. So I won't be surprised if we see more of this. I will be surprised if the media actually covers it.
What are the actual facts and figures? What are we dealing with here in some of the cities?
Well, in New York, we have seen a 23% increase in crime as of the end of June. During the same time period, we have a 39% increase in Chicago within the same time period. And I also know that Los Angeles is in double digits as well. I haven't been able to find exact numbers on that, but the article that I read did say that Los Angeles is also in double digits as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing the same thing in other major cities like Baltimore, DC, and others.
Well, now it appears there's a major manhunt underway for this guy in Brooklyn who really hammered some New York cops.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they catch them. But the thing is, the more that this happens, this isn't just a matter of defunding the police, but the police morale is going to continue to go down. I mean, the LAPD actually held a protest in response to this stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same thing from the New York Police Department. Whether they catch this guy or not, people are being emboldened to act out under the guise of, oh, I want to help the Black community. Really, these people are opportunists and they're criminals, but when's it going to stop? You wanted to take money from the police. That's not going to stop what's going on right now. That's just going to encourage it. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Right, but it's the people in the Black community that are in the inner cities that are really being hurt. I mean, that's the odd thing about this whole thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and that is why so many are speaking out. You won't hear about it on the media, but there are Black community leaders who are speaking out. The average Black person does not want to defund the police. They don't want to abolish the police. They want to reform the police. But now that the progressive Marxist movement has taken hold of the National Black Lives Matter organization and other Marxist organizations as well are taking advantage of what happened in the wake of the George Floyd killing. So what we're seeing is them basically having their agenda supersede what the people actually need and what the people actually want so that they can push their version of Marxism and their version of socialism. So it is really dangerous to see what they're doing here, especially since the people who are being affected by it don't have as much of a voice.
Well, how do you measure the impact of this civil unrest on people who live and work in the urban areas? And do you think this will ultimately translate in votes for either Biden or Trump?
You know, I don't think that this will affect things really at the presidential level, because I mean, the people that are dealing with this stuff are dealing with it with their own governments. So, I mean, there may be some who stay home because they don't think that any party is going to do anything. But the people who are going to vote for Trump have already decided that. I think the people who are going to vote for Biden have already decided that. I think at the very most, we may see people who might have voted for Biden stay home because now they're seeing that the Democrats actually have no interest in doing anything about this at all. And there are no Republicans in power in those cities. So I don't think it may have effect on the presidential elections, but there may be some consequences down ballot.
You know, far be it from me to try to know this, but I get the sense that a lot of Black folks are a lot more law and order than the media lets on. Is that a fairly accurate statement, or am I off base?
I think that's 100% correct. See, the thing is, Black people, like I said before, Black people don't want no police. They just want good police. They want the type of policing that's going to protect them, that's going to enforce the law. They want police officers to be held accountable when they do something wrong. And that's pretty much it. After that, clean up crime, protect families. You know, I think, you know, we talk a lot about the 94 crime bill, and a lot of people bring up the fact that a lot of Black people voted for that. And they wanted that to happen. Now, they had no idea how that was going to end up. I think if they did, they probably would change their minds. But the fact that they even were encouraging that shows that Black people do want law and order. They just want to make sure that it's equitable and that it actually does what it sets out to do.
Fair enough. That's Liberty Nation socio-political correspondent Jeff Charles. Thanks for joining us on Truth TV today, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
And stay cool.
I'll try.
Truth is making a comeback.
Anyone who's ever lived or worked in Washington knows why it's called the swamp. As the District of Columbia clears out due to the heat and humidity, this weekend we're expecting to hit about 100 degrees. A multitude of creatures lie just below the surface in the murky waters. News that the Defense Department has finally decided to go after leakers flew under the radar, but we'd like to oxygenate because this is a story of significance. Liberty Nation's military affairs correspondent Dave Patterson joins us now. Hi, Dave. Thanks for joining us on Truth TV today.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
All right. So in an article for Liberty Nation, you wrote that Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced an investigation into leaks of classified and sensitive unclassified information. This seems like a pretty big thing, but nobody's talking about it.
Well, you know, over the years, the leak of sensitive documents from government offices and specifically the Department of Defense have become kind of a boutique industry. I think it's time that steps were taken to find the culprits who do this and put a stop to it. And I think Secretary Esper's initiative is definitely a step in the right direction.
Somehow the First Amendment always seems to crop up when we begin to discuss leaks. But does that really apply here? Why or why not?
Well, you know, it doesn't apply. It simply does not apply. In the hearing that took place last week with Chairman of Joint Chiefs and Secretary Esper, in the Joint Chiefs Chairman's testimony, he tried to invoke the First Amendment free speech clause. But we're not talking about free speech. We're talking about the release of sensitive and classified national security information to people who have absolutely no right to that information. It's a breach of trust at best and certainly criminal behavior at worst.
The anonymous sources say media is masterful at floating leaks to the public. In your article, you outline a situation in a publication called Task and Purpose. Can you briefly relate this story to our viewers now?
Sure. The title of the Task and Purpose article was Leaked Pentagon Memo Warns of Real Possibility of COVID-19 Resurgence. Vaccine not coming until summer of 2021. Now, the memo that you refer to is supposed to be, or that the author refers to, is supposed to be from the Secretary of Defense. Haley Britsky, the writer, conveys her story as if the words in the memo were absolutely etched in stone. But by her own admission, we find out that the memo was a work product, not signed, and there's no indication that Secretary Esper, in fact, had ever seen it. And I suspect not. But her words paint this dire picture of a renewed outbreak of COVID-19. And the memo actually is a call to action recommending to the Defense Department not to reduce its focus on the mission. And I think that's a good thing.
It's interesting how this works itself out because, once somebody reports it, then a lot of other people report it. It's like managing editor Mark Angelides wrote, the mockingbird media, and the problem is, if it's leaked, let's say to the AP or to the Washington Post or to the New York Times, these are places with big microphones.
It is, in fact, what we refer to as the echo chamber. One person says it, then somebody else says it, and people are more likely to say it with authority if the word leaked memo is at the beginning.
Well, as you well know, leaking has been going on as long as life itself in Washington. Do you think this latest effort will ferret out the leakers, or it's just more smoke and mirrors? In other words, do you think Esper is really serious about this?
Well, as you say, the most famous, of course, was the leak of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times by Daniel Ellsberg back in June of 1971, and is always the case. The National Archives called the resulting narrative from the leak incomplete, and it suffered quality issues, and read that as being basically wrong. But senior leaders in government have complained about leaks for a long time, and I believe Secretary Esper is very serious. And the consequences to national security and the welfare of our war fighters, and not to mention the trust that we try to build between Pentagon executives, all are very serious and bad.
Well, I think this is a big story. Thanks so much for helping us oxygenate it a little bit. Thanks for being here today. That's Liberty Nation's military affairs correspondent, Dave Patterson.
Always great to be with you, Lisa.
Truth is making a comeback.
Presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden has dominated the polls for most of 2020, and that's made the Trump base more than a bit jittery. But just this week, the hefty lead enjoyed by the former vice president began to dissolve. Presidential poll numbers, even big ones, can radically change in a New York minute. Just ask Michael Dukakis. More on Mr. Mike later, but first, a moment to assess the current situation. A couple of months ago, the so-called basket of deplorables, we'll call them BODs, fell back on the old, well, the polls got it wrong the last time, didn't they? But the negative numbers for President Donald Trump have been so widespread and persistent, even the faithful needed some reassurance. Well, here it is. Without a doubt, it will be a rocky road to November 3rd, but just like the ice cream, Mr. Biden's lead is likely to melt as summer turns to fall. Until then, the BODs will need to buck up, hang on, and hold tight. For while the journey may be strewn with obstacles, victory is assured for the man in the Oval Office. You heard that right. Victory is assured. And how can this be said with such certitude? Here are 3 reasons. Number 1, the pendulum effect. The double sucker punch of COVID-19 and civil unrest ginned up by the Marxists leading Black Lives Matter has walloped the president. But Mr. Trump is nothing if not resilient, much like the U.S. economy. Both are bound to bounce back despite multiple attempts by the Democrats to do everything in their power to frighten the American people. From falsely spiking the COVID numbers to giving free rein to anarchists, the truth has a way of emerging despite the scare tactics. During this season of unrest, Mr. Biden has taken up with those on the hard left, and this will be his Waterloo. Americans are stereotypically fiercely independent and tend to be a moderate lot. Over 2 decades, Gallup has consistently reported that somewhere between 35 and 38% of the American electorate consider themselves moderate. But the former vice president has swung so far to the progressives, his pendulum has swayed past the American people. Bit by bit, Biden is removing himself from the moderate wing of his party, and this will not serve him well as the election draws nigh. Reason 2, the silent majority effect. If you thought there was a backlash of the silent majority in 2016, just hang on to your hat. Speak up at your own risk may be the order of the day, but this too has a way of rubbing Americans raw. It makes for a sore that festers and will eventually ooze out at the voting booth. While most Americans don't want to engage in confrontation, they're not likely to let that stop them from exercising their franchise on Election Day. The crazies running rampant in the streets only serve to firm up the resolve of this silent majority. A recent Monmouth poll studied what they called the secret voter. So at least some folks are waking up to the fact that there are plenty of Americans in the vast open spaces of America who keep their heads down, keep their mouths shut, but will not relinquish their vote to someone who has plans to bring the United States to its knees. In and around those amber waves of grain are the people who planted, grow it, harvested, and have had enough of the current madness. This, folks, is why voting booths come with curtains, because it's a private decision. This brings us to our third, final, and perhaps most significant reason for the BOD to be confident about the election: the Electoral College. Only a few pollsters got it right in 2016, and Helmut Norpoth, a political science professor, was among them. Norpoth developed something called the primary model, a presidential election forecast formula. There must be something to it because he's been dead on for about 25 of the 27 elections. Anyway, this time the good professor predicts 362 electors for President Trump. And even Ellen's Tim Donner projects 350 electoral votes for Trump. How can this be? The large urban centers of America, home to the behemoth members of the Fourth Estate, carry the loudest microphones. So from the New York Times to the LA Times, everyone is basically on the same page. Unfortunately, there is a little territory between the proverbial sea to shining sea, and it's filled to the brim with those in the BODs. And all of these places bring electors with them to the party. It's difficult for some to remember, but our republic is based on 50 state elections that, when put together, make for a national election. The brilliance here is that not only it protects the smaller states, but 50 smaller elections are a lot harder to rig than one big one. This is why calls that Trump will rig the election are utter nonsense. Look, the road to losing the presidency is littered with early frontrunners: Thomas Dewey in 1948, Richard Nixon in 60, James Earl Carter in 1980, George H.W. Bush in 92, John Kerry in 2004. But perhaps the starkest case of an early frontrunner who lost came in 1988. At the end of July, post-convention, Michael Dukakis had a lead of 17 points over Bush the father. Today, most Americans under the age of 30 would ask, Mike who? And that, dear deplorables, is precisely the point. And that's my viewpoint for today.
Truth is making a comeback.
And that's it for another edition of Truth TV. Thanks for tuning in. And remember to look up Liberty Nation in your favorite search engine and subscribe to our Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our new Roku channel. Remember, Liberty all the time and everywhere.
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click,
LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news
And remember, Liberty
today.
all the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London,
Trump rally in front of the American embassy,
bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Truth is making a comeback. Visit us at libertynation.com.